To begin, we're going to look at some swatches, then we're going to talk about the kit that you need, and then how you're actually going to swatch. If you want to swatch along, you will find a swatch pattern in the booklet that goes with this course. These are some of my design swatches, so they're quite generous in size. And that is the first thing I would say, that if you're going to swatch, make sure you do a representative size swatch. 1 inch by 1 inch is not a sufficient swatch. The next thing I would say is that you need to do different pattern elements. So for example, if the pattern has a lace or a cable pattern in it, you want to make sure that you have done enough of the pattern to make sure that it's representative of what you're going to get in the finished garment. Next consideration is the needles that you use for your swatch. I recommend using the needles that you are actually going to knit your project with. The reason for this is that you can get some variation between projects based on the needles that you're using. I also recommend making sure that if you are going to swatch in the round versus swatching flat. In relation to swatching in the round, please see the PDF that goes with this lesson. The final thing, and a question that I'm asked a lot, is how do I treat my swatch before blocking? Some people will do a full wet block, and other people will do just a dry steam press with an iron. My recommendation is that you treat your swatch like you treat your garment, because it is a great opportunity to see how your yarn will react to being treated as if you were wearing the final garment. In order to swatch, you do not need a huge amount of kit. The first thing you need is a flat piece of surface that you can put pins into. I'm using a square of my blocking mats, but you can use a play mat or any other surface that won't absorb water if it's going to be a wet block. You then need some T-pins. You can also use regular pins. And then a ruler. I like to use a ruler instead of a flexible measuring tape because I prefer the set rigid markings on a ruler just in case I might get the wrong measurement on a fabric tape. And that's all you need. You have knit your swatch and you are ready to go. You have two options. You can either do it wet or dry. I recommend that you do it in a way that you will treat your finished garment. That is probably the most representative way of doing your swatch. The next thing I would say is gently pin it out on the blocking board that you're using. Don't pull it too much because you don't want to stretch the stitches. You just want them to rest naturally, as if you were drying your garment. What you're trying to do is get something that is representative of your final finished garment, and not just how a square of fabric reacts to being treated in a particular way. Once you have pinned out your garment, you are now ready to find the stitches that you're going to count. So the stitches, if you're not familiar with this, are the little V's in your knitting. You want to check as well if you're using your cast on and your cast off edge so that you know which way your V's are traveling. Before the end of this video, I'll show you what those little V's look like close up. So locate the stitch that you're going to start with, and first make sure that you've plenty of space around the outside to get all of the things that you're going to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my life quite easy with the swatch, and I'm going to find a little V on the corner just above the stripe, which is actually quite a neat way of knowing what rows you're counting. So I'm going to insert my pin in the bottom left hand corner of that stitch. I'm then going to place my ruler against my pin and measure exactly 4 inches and then place another pin at the end. I'm not going to manipulate the stitches in any way. I'm just going to place my pin directly into the fabric. I'm then going to do the same on the rows. For measuring my rows, I will often give the fabric a little bit of a shake out, a little bit of a pull, but not changing the shape of it or distorting it, but just so that I can find a single column of stitches to count, because I don't want to be zigzagging across the work, finding different stitches. I want to do them all in a single column of stitches. I'm happy that I've identified a column of stitches that I want to count. I will then place my needle at the 4-inch mark again. As I did with the stitch count, I'm going to place it directly into the fabric and not manipulate it around the stitch at the top. This is to give you a true representation of any half stitches or half rows that might be in there. This is because you don't want to add or subtract any size by not counting your half rows or half stitches correctly. So So as you go, count the number of rows and the number of stitches in your fabric and write them down. It's definitely worth keeping a note of exactly what number of stitches and rows you got when you measured your swatch. If you are not familiar with what the stitches actually look like, let's take a close-up look. In your knitting, make sure that you know which side is your cast on and your cast off edge. And as you get closer, you will see the little V's are your stitches. So each stitch is made up of a left and a right part of the stitch. To get your stitch gauge, you count the stitches across the fabric, and to get your row gauge, you count the V's up and down in a column of V's in your work, as you can see me doing here. Once you're happy that you know your row and your stitch count, you are ready to see how you would adjust your pattern if your gauge doesn't match the gauge in the pattern.